Hey everybody, welcome back to another review, and this time we're talking about the Batman Chronicles Volume 4. This collects Detective Comics 51 through 56, Batman number 6 and 7, and then World's Finest Comics 2 and 3. So this is another 10 issues of the classic Bill Finger, Bob Kane Batman run, and we get a couple more supervillains here, and we get more Joker appearances, obviously. Overall, I think the first thing I want to say before we get too far deep into this is that I can understand if some people find these reviews a little bit boring, because the quality is so consistent that it's a little bit hard to talk about any one volume for more than a few minutes. I feel like I could go back and review the very first volume of this and have a lot more interesting things to say there. But just going through subsequent volumes, it actually gets a little bit more tricky because the quality is so constant that there's never really like a skipped beat. So we'll go ahead and do this issue by issue. We won't touch too much on the World's Finest stuff. The big thing I want to mention is when we get to the Scarecrow issue, but that's about it. So Detective 51 is the case of the Mystery Carnival, which is fun. It shows Bruce being a little bit more fatherly and showing to take a good time around at the carnival and playing games and such. The big mark of this run, the big thing that differentiates it from this volume from the others, is that there's lots more mobster stuff going on. This whole volume's got a very constant theme of Batman dealing with gangsters and mobsters and mob influence. And it seems like this is more pronounced here than it was anywhere else. And you open that up right away with like an extortion racket with the first issue. You go into the Secret of the Jade Box, which is Detective 52, and you've got another very kind of fantastical story, Batman dealing with Asian culture, and these are early comics, so naturally they're far more stereotypical, but it's still sort of a bit of a mob theme. It's still sort of a extortion kind of thing, protection kind of thing, and so you're seeing Batman as a more traditional social crusader than you do nowadays. This is more in line with the first volume than anything else, because it is very much about Batman going around and breaking up big organized mobs, as opposed to dealing with like rich people or anyone that escapes the law because of wealth or things like that. There's a couple of stories here where we do get supervillains, and I do want to mention those. The first one is when you go to World's Finest Comics number 3 and you get the Riddle of the Human Scarecrow, which is the first appearance of Scarecrow. And I actually really loved this. I thought this was fantastic. You get the origin of Scarecrow, and what you find is that Scarecrow as a kid was kind of bullied, and when he became a professor, well, he wasn't bullied. He was kind of a bully, now that I'm thinking about it. He was kind of a bully. He would go through and like scare birds and stuff, and that's something that stayed pretty consistent throughout most of his origins. Over time, you had it be more of a kids bullied him because he was like this tall Scarecrow-like figure. Everyone compared him to the character from Sleepy Hollow, so he kind of just adopted that. But here he didn't have that. Here he just liked making people afraid, and so he became a psychology professor and started teaching fear. And he overheard that people still kind of look down at him because he wears like raggy old clothes, even though he gets paid just as much as everybody else, and he spends every cent he has on books. So he becomes a criminal out of desperation for more money to get more books. That's the big thing he wants all the way through, is just more books and more knowledge. And him trying to do this makes him a worse and worse person, and eventually makes him lose his job because he fired off a gun in class. And so he kind of loses himself in this pursuit for material possession, which is another big thing that the Bill Finger Batman comics deal with, which is like the loss of humanity through the acquisition of any sort of material wealth. And he decides to use the appearance of a scarecrow because he thinks it's the ultimate symbol of fear, but also the ultimate symbol of poverty. And that's something that Steve Englehart picks up on much, much later when he does his run in the 70s. I really like this idea that Scarecrow is sort of like this psychological fear of the lack of wealth, but he's created by this consumer to amass more wealth. I think that parallel works really well together and it makes him just as twisted as any other Batman villain. And it's another added dimension to the Scarecrow villain that makes him one of my favorite Batman characters, because he's able to be written in so many different ways. I think that might actually be hands down my favorite issue of this particular trade. Throughout this, we mostly have just the same sort of things over and over again. Batman number 6 is just more mob stories, some police stuff here and there. Detective 55 and 56 get a little bit more bizarre, a little bit more sci-fi, but still pretty fun nonetheless. And then Batman number 7, you get a Joker story called Wanted Practical Jokers, which is kind of fun. Not great, but kind of fun. Joker is becoming more and more of a jokester as this goes on. He's laughing a lot more. He's a little bit less threatening, and I think this is the weakest of the Joker's appearances so far. Then you get the Double Trap, which is okay. The big highlight for issue 7 is when you get to the very end of it and you get the issue called, or you get the story called The People versus Batman. And Bruce Wayne gets framed for murder. You actually see the whole setup. And Dick Grayson has to go around and do his own detective work to try and free him. And the big lesson at the end of the day is that Batman is a personality that saves Bruce Wayne. Literally in that Batman is used to find evidence to prove Bruce Wayne is innocent. But also more metaphorically in that Batman's the thing that Bruce Wayne created in his mind to save himself. And that's something that he kind of just runs with. And so every time he's in the least bit of trouble, being Batman is the thing that brings him out of it. And I think that's really interesting from a psychological standpoint. But then also just to use a Dick Grayson all the way through this, him being able to be a good detective in his own right and pick up on clues, and being very active throughout this whole book as opposed to just kind of being useless without Batman. It shows really good judgment in how Finger was able to write that character and not make him just a kid that palled around with Batman, that he's extremely capable. And it also adds a little bit back to the origin, where Batman is not crazy for trying to take a kid into the world of crime fighting, because clearly this kid has means and he's got abilities. And so the best way to channel them is through this. It adds a little bit of maturity to that whole thing. It's a really enjoyable read. The best thing about these early Batman comics is that all the stories tend to be really short, and even when they get a little bit wordy, it's all necessary, it's all fun, it's all atmosphere building. And I really recommend people going in and trying to buy these. I know some of them are out of print at this point, but if you can find a way to get them, or you can get the Golden Age Batman Omnibus that's coming out, any way to get access to these early issues of Batman, I'd highly recommend. They're just a lot of fun, but they're also really deep and they're also really interesting. The big thing you get here, the big add-on to the Bat mythology, aside from Scarecrow and the Robin relationship, is you get the full-on Batmobile. We called it the Batmobile on and off in previous volumes, but it was still just a red sedan. Here you do get a full-blown black car with a bat and wings on the back, traveling around. It's full-on Batmobile, and I do really like that. You don't have a Batcave yet. You've been toying around with that so far. Batman does have a place where he keeps all of his equipment, but it's not called the Batcave yet. But anyway, I do really like this. I don't think I like it as much as Volume 1 or Volume 3. It's probably on par with Volume 2, but this is still really enjoyable. This is still fun, and the Scarecrow story alone, I think, is reason enough to pick this up. So yeah, let me know what everyone else thinks, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said. I know this was really brief, but I just didn't have a lot to say here. It's a fun volume, and I don't know how much more I'm going to have to say as we keep going with this. The stories still stay at a pretty consistent quality even after this volume. But just make sure you know what you're getting into when you're reading Golden Age Batman, that there's a lot of stuff that isn't there yet, and seeing the first appearances and the growth of it is partly why I find this stuff to be so interesting and so much fun to read. You also can't judge them on a traditional comic book level. You have to kind of keep them to the standards of what was being published back then. And around that time with the Superman comics and with some of the other copycat superheroes, I think this and Superman were the best titles out there. Maybe Superman a little bit more so, because that was a little bit more grounded in more political things. But this is still great stuff. So thanks everybody for listening. Let me know what you think, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said, and I'll see you next time for another review.